I am back at the Fashion for Good Museum in Amsterdam, which recently opened its second chapter of the exhibition Knowing Cotton Otherwise. This phase is titled Bodies of Work, with added installations referring to both human and non-human entities. One of these new installations is Curative, Confronting and Healing the Fashion Industrial Complex by Sha'Mira Covington, who is with me today to share more about the installation, but also her work and process. Welcome.
Thank you.
How are you feeling?
I'm good. How about you?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm excited to have a conversation with you again. We already spoke before.
Yeah.
But I'm excited to learn more. Before we delve into the installation, I just want to start by you introducing yourself. Tell us who you are and what your practice is.
Sure. I'm Sha'Mira Covington. I'm currently a PhD candidate at the University of Georgia in the Department of Merchandising, Interiors, and the Institute for African American Studies. My work really surrounds tracing the inception of the fashion industrial complex to the transatlantic slave trade, also fashion as an embodied practice implicated in resistance movements and cultural sustainability. That's me professionally and academically. Personally, I am the descendants of enslaved people in the Americas. I am descendant of conjurers and magic workers, root workers in the Americas. Yeah.
I want to start out by kind of defining a term, because you kind of make a distinction between fashion industry and fashion industrial complex, which is also part of the title of this installation.
Yes.
Tell me what the thought behind this is and why you make this distinction.
Sure. So I view the fashion industry as more than just the industry, as we call it. I liken the fashion industry to the prison industrial complex, in which policy, legislation, different entities are implicated in a part of the process. There's a historical legacy associated with the fashion industrial complex, and I don't think the fashion industry is adequate to encompass all of the aspects.
When we talk about the specific installation of yours right now at the museum, I felt like I wanted to ask you more about the installation and your process behind it, but I think that it goes far beyond in a way, because you have been dealing with the subject of cotton and like its role in history for longer. So I want to ask you about Curative, but I also want to know what has led you up until here, and what your process has been to get to this point, basically.
Sure. My process is very personal. I feel a deep connection to cotton, as knowing that my ancestors had a deep connection to cotton and the land and the environment. And so my process really comes from healing that disconnection that I have through forced migration through slavery and forced labor through slavery. So I approach my work through that lens and that trail of healing unknown knowledges and legacies based on slavery, or from slavery rather. And so my work not only looks at cotton and the fashion industrial complex as an ancestral movement, but also a personal one. I studied fashion, my undergraduate degrees in fashion merchandising. I worked in the fashion industry for 10 years before pursuing a master's degree. And I felt a deep connection to fashion and clothing the body, but I did not feel a deep connection to the commercialization of it, or the commodifying of it, the consumption, overconsumption, I should say, of it. So, and I didn't know why that was until I started to think more deeply about what it means or what my connection or position in the fashion industrial complex was.
Yeah.
So that's really where the heart of my work is.
Yeah. And then you are so like, you are very much familiar with the subject because you research it and you work with it, you create an installation around it. But I'm curious what you think, how aware people are today of the role it has played in history and also its consequences up until this day, and why it's important to create more awareness around this in an accessible way.
I don't think people are aware enough of the history behind it, and that's by design. We glamorize the fashion industry. It's about art and beauty, not the ugly truths that it comes from. So I don't think people know enough about it. I think once you start to make these connections, it's very obvious.
You can't unsee it.
You can't unsee it, yeah. Right? And they're blatant and they're obvious. But again, this commercialization of clothing and our bodies in the fashion industrial complex makes that history hidden and erased. So I think it's extremely important that people do know the histories as well as delve into their own personal histories to fashion, to cotton, to any clothes that they wear, because I think that's the only way that we foresee a sustainable future as far as our connection to what we put on our bodies.
Yeah, and another aspect that I see, I mean, I agree with everything that you just said, by the way. Another aspect that I see coming back a lot in your work is embodiment. Even the things that you already mentioned now kind of touch upon that. And this is a subject I personally find very interesting as well and important. So I want to ask you why you find it important that embodied experiences and embodied knowledge is something that is reflected, especially when talking about a subject like cotton. And also if it's something that you do consciously, when we look at your work, that we can, see it back and look at it. And I'm just wondering, like, did you make these decisions? I mean, obviously you make decisions consciously when creating an installation, but when you're busy with your work, to what extent do you think this is an aspect that needs to be in there? And then to follow up, sorry, long question, in what way can we also see it maybe looking at your installation?
Yeah, so my preoccupation with embodiment really began as I was starting my studies, and at first it was unconscious. I didn't put my finger on, or I couldn't put my finger on what to call it. I started to get very interested in embodiment when I realized that the body was so central to the work that I was trying to do, but it was ignored or underappreciated. We very rarely talk about the body when we're looking at fashion, for example. Yes, it's on a body, but we don't see that body, we see the fashion. And so that's where my my interest in the body really developed. I think once I realized that, I'm not really talking about just the clothes or just the materials or just the textiles. I'm talking about the essence within it, the person within it, the being within it. Then I started making conscious decisions about how to relay that to someone other than myself. So I did make conscious decisions in the exhibit around embodiment, around how I displayed the objects, about the stories or specific stories that the objects told. I think those were unconscious and conscious. I did it without thinking about it, and then later said, it's coming back. It's coming back. It's deeply connected, yeah.
Yeah, I think obviously when talking about this subject, when talking about cotton, talking about its historical significance is inevitable, but at the same time, Fashion for Good always looks at the past, present, and future. So I also want to ask you how you think our relationship is today with clothing and what has to change.
I think we're very detached from our clothing, and these are conversations that are being had in sustainability realms already. We don't know who made our clothes. We don't consider the labor that went into our clothing. We don't consider the materials, what it takes to wash them. And this is, again, by design. Fast fashion says that clothing is disposable and it doesn't matter. You can just trash it when you don't want it anymore. And that's still that's still our relationship with our clothing. But I think if we do center embodiment and we center this sort of historical healing process, that you have to be more connected to your clothes. You pick your clothing for a reason. There's some attraction that you have to it, subconscious or consciously. And that's connected to you as a person. Your stories, your histories, your culture, whatever knowledges you have. And so the fact that we view clothing as disposable, yet it's such a personal and important object to our lives, there's like this dissonance to me. And I think it can be closed by, again, centering embodiment, the human or non-human, the spiritual and the mental. All of that goes into kind of garnering this sustainable thought process that's not environmentally sustainable, but mental and emotional and spiritually sustainable, which in turn becomes environmentally sustainable.
But then I'm wondering, isn't the problem also that this connection with clothing and the connection with sense of self and how that kind of relates to what you wear and what you put onto your body, isn't that something that we've lost touch with a little bit? And that's the you know what I mean, like which makes it difficult, because maybe some people, even though they make conscious decisions about what they put on or subconscious decisions, it is not as conscious as, and it doesn't, sometimes clothing lost a little bit of the meaning, I feel, which makes it more difficult to have an approach like that, and makes it easier for like fast fashion to rise. Yeah. Because there's less meaning in a way, maybe?
Yeah, I don't think so though. I don't think that clothing has lost its meaning. I think that it doesn't matter if we choose it consciously or unconsciously, it still has meaning. Like if you put on a t-shirt because you want to be lazy that day, it still has meaning. You want it to be lazy that day, so you put on a t-shirt. So I think it still has meaning. We just don't look at the deeper meanings of it. We ignore those because we view them as non-important or frivolous, or it's just the aesthetic. But all clothing that we put on has value. It has to, because it's on our bodies, and our bodies are the most valuable things.
True. And then to round off, I want to touch up on healing again, even though we spoke about it before. Curative, confronting and healing the fashion industrial complex. What I'm curious about is, we talked about a non-linear healing process, and you explained to me that there is no linear process because you get traumatized and you heal again, and it's something that isn't with a start and a beginning, which I very much agree with. But I'm wondering how that relates to the fashion industrial complex in this case. Because I can relate to it very much on a personal note, but I think sometimes it can be hard to grasp on a macro level what that means. Yeah,
so if we're thinking about the fashion industrial complex and healing as a companion to capitalism, it's very hard to see some healing trajectory for the fashion industrial complex, I think. Especially because of overconsumption, because of the environmental issues around it, because of the human rights issues about it. However, consumption is not gonna go away. Like, we need things. We'll always need things. We'll always need to trade or buy and consume. So I view this healing process as first acknowledgement, and then as payment, as not only acknowledging these histories, but paying for them. And so I think the fashion industrial complex, healing it, requires those two components, and requires those two components to happen on personal and macro levels. Yeah. So us as consumers doing that, and then these corporations and companies and legislators who are all a part of this fashion industrial complex to also do that.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you for sharing all of your thoughts with me, and also for sitting here with me again in your lovely installation. For everyone that also wants to see more of Sha'Mira's work and the installation, you can come by at the Fashion for Good Museum right here in Amsterdam and take a look for yourself. And yeah, thank you so much for listening to us.